For those of you who have never thought about academics as a vocation, I hope that tonight gives you a taste for the kind of work we do and also the socialization that we do. It is not just sitting in a library behind a stack of books or in the archives or even out in the field interviewing folks, but it is really, it's a way of life.
When I thought of who would be a good person to begin this, I thought of this amazing young scholar from Columbia University who I had met in the course of doing research for the Bronx African American History Project. We had interviewed this wonderful activist from the Bronx named Cleo Silvers. And Cleo had been moved to the Bronx when she was 17 and become a member of the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords organization, and had been very involved in the movement to transform Lincoln Hospital from what was known as a butcher shop that was deeply dangerous to everyone in the Bronx or Harlem who went there into a place that provided, you know, decent and safe service for those who used it. And in the course of, Cleo and I became friends, and she said, you have to meet this amazing young scholar who was at that time at Yale, who is working on the health and community programs of the Black Panther Party. And so we met for, I guess it was somewhere between lunch and dinner at this hip new place in the Bronx called the Bruckner Bar and Grill. Have any of you eaten there? Okay, yeah. I mean, it's part of Bronx gentrification, but unfortunately, like most gentrified places, the food is good. So, you know, Professor Nelson and I, you know, began communicating. It turned out that she was going to Berlin on a trip, and I had a lot of friends in touch then. And her research has achieved national recognition through papers she's given, and her book is like out today. So I figured, what an ideal person to bring back this project. Because again, the idea is not just bring back somebody who is doing groundbreaking research, but bring somebody who's a real person who can talk with our students about how she got to this path. Because all of us have circuitous paths. I think that this is a real thrill to bring back somebody who I know our students and our alumni will relate to personally as well as intellectually. So, without further ado, let me bring up Alondra Nelson to talk about many things.
Book with me because it's only just come out today, as Mark said. But I wanted to begin with the book, and in some senses, because there was a moment where someone had said to me at age 20 or age 21, you know, you can write a book, or you might write a book someday. I would have thought they were out of their minds. I mean, I just couldn't have possibly ever imagined such a thing. So, you know, and I'll tell you a little bit about my background and some of the reasons why, but I think, you know, in the scheme of things, very few people ever write books in their lifetime, right? And I think, given your particular background and your experiences, it becomes rarer still. So my experience is that, you know, I come from pretty much a working class family. My father was in the military. He grew up in the Lafitte projects in New Orleans. My mother went to college as, are you from New Orleans?
No.
Oh, you are, okay. So you know the Lafitte projects, they just tore them down. My mother went to college as an adult learner, right? So she went to college when I was a little girl, in addition to working 2 jobs, right? So she was, so my parents were always struggling for education, but one of the things I want to say in the context of Fordham and in front of Father is that, you know, they invested a lot of money in giving me a Catholic education. So I had a very circuitous route, but I think has very much to do with the fact that I had a Catholic education, that I was actually able to come back from my circuitous route, and I've had 2 jobs in Ivy League schools. So I don't want my story to be, you know, you to come away with thinking it's a hard luck story. I mean, I think I had a really good foundation, and that's why my circuitous route works. So I graduated from high school in 1986. I graduated from college in 1994. So lots of stuff happened in between those years. It took me, effectively 8 years to finish college. It was a very circuitous route. And part of the circuitous route is that I had no idea what college was for. I didn't know why I was supposed to be there. I didn't know, when I was applying for college, I didn't have a sort of sense that there were a list of colleges that I should apply for. I grew up in San Diego, California, I applied to the state school in San Diego. I didn't really, I didn't have sort of safety schools and a long list and a strategy and a counselor and all of these things that are common in New York. And nor could my parents help me with my application. So they were just kind of like, we don't know, fill it out, go for it, good luck, So I initially went to the state school. I went to San Diego State University for my first year out of college. And I had no idea what I was doing there. I didn't know what I was studying there. I honestly did not know what college was for. And I initially was studying the classics was my major. And, I had a big row with my father who grew up in the projects and said, what are you going to do with the classics? What are you going to do with the Parthenon and all of that? He's like, what are you doing today? And I was saying, Dad, we were identifying slides of the Parthenon on the midterm. I got an A, And he was like, what are you doing? And I kind of said, I don't know what I'm doing. And he wanted me to get a business degree and do something practical. And so I actually stopped going to college. I just stopped going after the first year. And because I didn't know exactly what I was meant to be doing there. And I would initially go back part-time, and I would work full-time, and I would work in retail, and I would work at cafes, and I had a kind of bohemian thing in San Diego, riding around on motorcycles and reading poetry. Thinking we were, working in a cafe, pulling coffees, and, I had that sort of trajectory. But I think in that process, I got to figure out what it was I wanted to do. I realized, in fact, that this odd thing that I had been quite good at my whole time as a student, right, from elementary school through high school, and I went to USD High School, which is a Catholic high school in San Diego, and that I had been really good at this. And moreover, and Father used the word vocation, I realized that it was a vocation, right, that I felt increasingly sort of called to think about ideas and to read books, and moreover to sort of fill out this sort of empty space and sort of history and sociology about Black people's experiences more particularly, right? Like on the one hand, it was exciting to go to college and be able to find an African American Studies program or a department and sort of find these books and just like, I was ravenous reading these books, right, about Black experience and about the experience of poor people of color in the US. But on the other hand, there was so little, right? You could read very quickly through a whole bunch of literature in a short amount of time. And I felt like there were questions that I wanted to answer about the world and things that I wanted to say. And so I go back to college full time. I go back to UC San Diego, to the University of California at San Diego. And I start taking courses in anthropology. I start taking courses in African history. So my major was in anthropology. I did a minor in Caribbean literature and a minor in African history. And so I cobbled together for myself effectively an African diaspora studies major, right? And I still didn't know what I wanted to do. And I had these really wonderful, at the time, really young professors. So one is a woman named Tanya Lerman, who's a really prominent anthropologist now. But I came to sort of see myself. I saw people who were, 29. One was Stephanie. One of my professors was Stephanie McCurdy, who's a historian at Penn now, who writes on the slave trade and writes on the 19th century. And I think when she taught me at UCSD, she was maybe 29. She was just going up for tenure. And so for me to see people who sort of were, and also I think, in retrospect, actually, some of my teachers at elementary school were Irish nuns and priests who had come from Ireland to sort of work at this church in San Diego, and Stephanie McCurry is Irish, and so that had a sort of thing for me, the fact that she had this Irish accent and she was working on Black people's history, and so I just could see myself in these young women faculty and faculty of color that I had. And so then I started thinking, like, I'm really good at this, like, what if? Like, what if I could be, like Professor Cox, like, what if I could be like that? I couldn't, and there was nothing in my experience that led me to think that this could be a profession. There are no academics in my family. There are no writers in my family. No one said to me, like, you can actually go in a room for thousands of hours and sit by yourself and write a book, No one said to me that you can sit for hundreds of hours in a library and that people do this, and I mean, I had no idea what I was getting into, no idea whatsoever. But this goes back again to this word vocation. I felt like there was nothing else I could do. Like, I felt like I had to do it. I had to read these books. And by the time I got to graduate school, I had to at least try to write a book, you know. So I finished at UC San Diego, or I'm finishing actually, and I end up in a program that's probably like this program, right? I think it's now called the McNair Scholars Program at San Diego. It was called something, UC San Diego, it was called something else. And I just had great teachers at UCSD, and one of my really great teachers is, I guess he calls himself a sociologist these days, but a gentleman named George Lipsitz who teaches at, there you go, explains it all. Who teaches now at UC Santa Barbara, but at the time taught at UC San Diego. And George was my mentor for a summer research program, and he was like, well, what do you want to write about? And I said, I'm really interested, you guys are going to laugh, you're going to laugh. I'm really interested in these talk shows. Like, why do people watch talk shows? These like Oprah, Donahue, Ricky Lake, you know, what's going on? How can I, you know, is that something I can study? And George says, yeah, you know, I write about John Yotis, I write about jazz, like you can definitely think about television. And I said, really? And so George for me was like, you know, he opened up a world of topics I didn't think were legitimate topics to study. And he said, yeah, they're legitimate. And moreover, there's lots of like really prominent people who study them. So he introduced me to the work of people like Stuart Hall, and George's own work on television in the 1950s, right? He wrote about sort of, and all sorts of really terrific work. And I thought like, so I'm good at this. I'm starting to think, what if? I'm in this sort of summer bridge program that's allowing me to sort of imagine myself as a faculty person, like, God, maybe I'll just try. So I do this research paper with George, and that paper becomes my writing sample for graduate school. And I go to George and I say, I think I'm going to apply for graduate school. I think I'm going to try in the Northeast. I want to get out. I'm ready to get out of California. And, you know, but again, like I said, when I applied for UCSD, you know, and for San Diego State, my parents could not help me with applications. Like, they didn't know a college application from anything. They really just didn't know. And because my mother was an adult student, she never, you know, she has a college education, she has a graduate degree, but she never had to apply for college in the way, or graduate school in the way that you apply. You just kind of go and sign up and give them a check, right? And so, so George says, well, you know, I think you're going to get into every school you apply to. I was like, wait, what? Like, what are you talking about, man? You know. So I was a good student at UCSD. I graduate with honors in anthropology. I'm Phi Beta Kappa. So I mean, I am good at it, right? There are signs that I'm doing okay at this. But I still just could not imagine in my head that the life of the mind could be my life. Like, I didn't even know how to think about that. And so George helped me to get there a little bit. He helped me to get there because he helped me to see that the things that I was curious about were legitimate. They were things that people studied, that there were scholars who had studied it before me. And then he said, you're going to get into every school that you apply to. I mean, that was not my imagination of myself, that I was a good scholar, and that I could be a scholar that could teach other scholars, you know. And so I applied to all of these graduate schools in the Northeast, get into all of these graduate schools in the Northeast, and I applied to these graduate schools with the help of UCSD had a program that allowed you to get grants for your applications, because, you know, I don't know how much they are now, but at the time graduate school applications were $75, $85 a piece, and I applied for 8 graduate schools. I mean, I did not have that money at all. Are they the same now?
No, a little higher.
A little higher, yeah. So, you know, it was like, you come up with, you know, $800, $900. And so I went and looked at schools, and, you know, I got into, and this is part of my circuitousness as well in graduate school, is that, you know, my parents thought I was crazy. So I applied for anthropology programs, PhD programs, because that's what I had studied as an undergraduate. So I get into the anthropology program at Columbia, I get into the anthropology program at Princeton, and a bunch of other schools, Brown and Northeast. And George had said to me, well, you know, there's this one American Studies program. You know, I said, like, George, I don't even know what American Studies is. I've never heard of it. Like, I don't even know what that is. Like, what are you talking about? We didn't have anything called that. He's like, well, go ahead and apply. There's interesting people. And so this was at NYU, and at the time, sort of people like Robin Kelly had just arrived, whose work some of you know, Tricia Rose had just arrived. The American Studies program there had just been sort of revamped. And so, you know, I have to go to my parents and say, I'm not going to go to get a PhD at Princeton or Columbia, Mom and Dad. No. I'm going to go to NYU, which they never heard of. And part of what called me to NYU is that I felt like with the same relationship I had with George provided for me, and a lot of my other teachers at UCSD, both a profound sense of safety and a deep sense of freedom at the same time, right? So that like, I knew that they weren't gonna let me fail, but I also knew that they were gonna let me try and try and try. And I felt that a little bit in the anthropology programs that I was being, I knew I was an Americanist, so I knew I wanted to study American culture, I knew I wanted to study probably mostly contemporary culture. And I was still getting in anthropology programs a little pushback about doing the 4 fields and about, as an undergraduate I had done an archaeology summer on these Catalina Islands, I had done a dig, I didn't want to have to do that again. I didn't want to have to study archaeology again. I didn't want to have to, a couple people had said, well, maybe you can do some research in Ghana and then you can work on black people in the US. And I was like, I don't want to work on Ghana. I want to work in the US. And so I ended up at NYU in this crazy American Studies program. Nobody knew what it was. And here we were doing our work. And I started thinking, so I was still thinking a little bit about television, and I initially in graduate school was thinking about doing a project on sort of post-Cosby era, representations of African Americans on television. And I get to graduate school, and so many of the people I had gone to college with and friends that I knew who were my same age in New York City, but who weren't in graduate school, were making all of this money. They were rich. And I was living on a stipend. And I was like, what is happening? And so these rich people were working in Silicon Valley. They were like 20-year-olds who were making like $80,000, $90,000 a year. It was the middle of the tech boom. So I thought, gosh, what is going on with all of this technology stuff? Like, what's happening, and where, what is happening? And what does this mean for black people? Because I was really sophisticated in my thinking. What's the bottom line for black people? And so I started thinking, trying to think about ways in which I could think about the experience of black people in the US and thinking about science and technology. So I'm slowly inching towards the things that I would study. And at the same time, I'm in graduate school at a time where some of the really important books are works that are about works that are making an argument about race as a social construction, right? But that are making the argument by showing by sort of exposing and highlighting the sort of the downside or the fallacy of scientific racism, right? So I'm reading works by people like Sandra Gilman and some essays by Evelyn Hammonds and works by George Fredrickson. So all these works that sort of show us, and even works like Racial Formation, right? Oh, Me and Why Not? Works that are showing us how sort of race came to be constructed over time in these various sites, in the law, and of course in medicine and in science. And so part of this, of course, are things like the Tuskegee experiment, and I'll talk a little bit briefly about Tuskegee when I get to the Panther part of my talk. And I'm just thinking, what were black people thinking about the experience of being racialized in science and in medicine? Like, were there challenges to this? Was there resistance to this? Were there even just reflections and observations about what was happening? Is there a way that we can talk about responses to scientific racism? Is there a way that is there a legacy of African Americans doing this as an intellectual tradition or doing it as a social movement tradition? And that's where I started to sort of think about these questions. So those questions really about the social construction of race, right? About how race is sort of created, both from the top down, and this is the racial formation theory, right? So race is a process that's created, particularly after the 1960s, from the top down and from the bottom up. And so I was interested in thinking about what happens from the bottom up, right? I was thinking history from below, as folks would call it. So I write this one seminar paper. Are you guys, any of you guys in graduate school? Some of you are, a couple of you are. So, what paper you're working on now might be your dissertation, might be a chapter of your dissertation, right? So I start writing this paper, like, right? It's crazy. Huh?
Pray.
You pray it is? So you guys are you're more sophisticated than me. For me, I didn't know what I was doing still. I was just, I felt a little bit like, the black girl Forrest Gump. Like, things are just fall into place. Like, I didn't even have like an imagination that like, this is gonna be a dissertation chapter. I was like, it's really interesting. Let me try to think through it and work through it. I have no idea, And so I write this paper about the Black Panther Party's health activism. I heard a little bit about it, their sickle cell anemia testing. And so I write this very schematic, not terribly interesting paper. But I become really interested And effectively, what I discovered is that you had working class 20-year-old black kids doing genetic screening in parks. Like, what? Really? Where'd they get the test? Like, how do they know the science? Like, what is happening? I mean, this is fairly sophisticated. And so that got me sort of thinking about a whole range of things. And at the same time, I'm thinking still about these, the people I'm jealous of. I envy for the Silicon Alley tech people. And at the same time this is happening, there's these conversations happening about how cyberspace is going to free us from race. That like, race is a, why are you shaking your head? Come on! It's true, and we're living in a post-racial America as well. Sure we are. Oh, I teach a class, actually, I'm teaching a lecture course. This is the second year I'm teaching it at Columbia, called, in the sociology department, called Post-Racial America, ? So it's post-racial America, and every week the answer is no. The students, it's like midterm, I think the students have caught on. So thinking about technology and what's happening, and also the sort of ways in which quickly these sort of structural technical changes became discourses about race and racial equality and racial inequality, led me to sort of start a project called Afrofuturism, right? Which was an online community, which was eventually a special issue of Social Text that I edited as a graduate student. I also co-edited with some friends from graduate school a book called Technicolor, an edited collection, which were sort of communities of color writing about race and technology. And so what I said about George Lipsitz is true at NYU. We both got like a safety net and we got lots of freedom. And they were like, race and technology, like what does that have to do with anything together? Like what are you talking about? And I had great teachers like Trisha Rose. I was like, makes sense to me, write it up, So I say that to say that, but I had lots of people giving me that information and giving me those suggestions. And so for those of you who are thinking about going to graduate school, I think part of what my circuitous trajectory suggests is that, don't go to graduate school for one person, that the safety net is woven from lots of different people who can give you different things. I mean, you have a lot of different needs, and if you go for the one person, they may leave, you may not like them, you often don't like them. So, anything can happen. But also go to a place where you feel like you can be your best self, where you're not sort of hemming in any of the aspirations, as wild as they may seem, right? I mean, the way that the academy works, the way that Life of the Mind works, and the way it can stay interesting and exciting for you is if you're doing exactly what you care about and what you love, right? And there's no way that you can go to graduate school for 5, 6, 7 years and then take that project and turn it into a book over the course of 2, 3, 4 more years if you don't really love it, right? And so you can't, as much as there are things about professionalization, you have to do your exams, you have to learn how to write in a certain way and speak in a certain language. I think for those of you who are thinking about graduate school, the core of who you are right now is what's going to sustain you through that long haul, right? So part of what you should be thinking about is about sort of the professional goals and career goals that you have for yourself, and even the activists among you, there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with wanting and having a pension and some health insurance, right? And at the same time, you want it to sustain you because it's work that we do alone, it's work that we do that doesn't give you immediate gratification, it's gratification over a way, sort of a long haul. And so it has to be the thing that it's like that slow burning fire that just is burning in you. It's the vocation again, it's the sort of calling. And it's this question that you have to answer that's burning, that you just so desperately want to answer. And so, I think that so I finished this, so then my trajectory gets weirder still. So, I finished college in 8 years. I go to do a PhD in a discipline I've never heard of. I go to do a PhD on a topic that has nothing to do with what I thought I was going to work on. And then it comes time to apply for jobs, and I don't know, I'm like, oh, I'll apply for African American Studies, American Studies, now that I think I kind of know what it is, and I guess I'm certified to do that since my PhD's in. And then I applied for this one sociology, African American Studies sociology joint job at Yale, right? Because it's about, the job says something like, and again, this is like, at the risk of getting sort of, this is the Forrest Gump thing again, this is the black girl Forrest Gump. So the job says something like, we're looking for someone who works on the sociology of race and ethnicity and who also works on science and media. I was like, really? Really? So, you know, I'm not a sociologist, but I think, how can I not apply for that job? You know, like, what's happening? I wouldn't recommend this to any of you. And I think it will, you know, these are things that don't happen very often. But so I go and get my job talk, I get the job. I'm a sociologist. Okay. So, and I was there for several years and I loved it. It was a great experience. And I've been teaching in the sociology department at Columbia for a couple of years now. So now I'm really a sociologist. But I think what's true across all of those trajectories and spaces and institutional sites is that I've had, and I know that you have it here, just having met Dr. Mangan, I can tell, and knowing Mark, that you guys have had just terrific mentorship here, and that you've had both that sort of safety net and also that, you know, that sort of sense that no one's trying to sort of limit your horizons, right? That people want you to sort of do great things and change the world and transform the world. So I think that's all I'll say about the trajectory. But you know, I think that we all have, as Dr. Nelson said, our different trajectories, and there's no one way that future professors get there, you know. And so it's definitely the case that I have colleagues, and I went to school with people who both their parents were academics, you know, that's fairly common, or one of their parents were academics, was an academic, and so they grew up with lots of books. I mean, the other thing about my experience growing up was like, in my house, we would have on 2 radios and like 2 TVs at once, you know. And I had a lot of colleagues who grew up in households that were a lot more monastic, right? It's like everyone read together, the house was quiet, they read books, they had a library, you know. My house did not look like that. I mean, I'm one of 4 siblings, my brothers were running around and throwing things, they, you know, they had like, you know, the Beastie Boys on the radio, and like, so, you know, all of this stuff is happening. I didn't sort of have that background, and so I had to teach myself to have that kind of monastic space with my work, and sometimes it's difficult, right? Sometimes, particularly if you're a quite social person like I am, but it also, because it's the thing, you know, if you're doing the thing that you love, it's also greatly pleasurable. I mean, it's like such a luxury and such a privilege to go in an archive, to read a book, to find a quiet space. And so many people just never have that luxury or that privilege. I mean, I really feel like it's kind of a blessing. And I, you know, academics like to gripe about the tenure track and all of our service and like whatever, but I actually think it's the best job in the world. I can just imagine. I mean, I feel like it's a boondoggle almost, you know? I'm like, do I really get paid to do this? Because, and partly it's because I don't know anybody, like I didn't grow up knowing people that did this. And, you know, when I first started teaching at Yale, my father, who grew up in the Lafitte Projects, was so proud. He called me in my office in New Haven, and he said to me, he said, "So, how many hours of work are you in the classroom? A week are you in the classroom?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know, Dad. This semester is 3.5 or 4." And he said, "What do you only work 4 hours a week? Like, what do you?" Like, you know, and I'm like, "No, I work like 60 hours a week. Like, I don't want you to think it's an easy job. I mean, we work a lot." I said, "No, Dad, I work like 60, 70 hours a week. I work all the time." And now with like, you know, people like Ellen sending us emails at 3 o'clock in the morning. You wake up and you have like, you go to bed, your email box is empty. You wake up, it's full, right? Because undergraduates are emailing overnight in the sleeping hours. So, you know, you're constantly working. There's always something you could be doing and you should be doing. But I also feel like, you know, my dad it didn't compute for him, right? The kind of work that I do. And I think he now gets it a little bit more. But we work really hard, but we work at our own pace, and we work at the things that we love, and we work at things that are sometimes autobiographical, but often things that are extensions of our passions, of about our curiosities about the world, and that's just a rare and beautiful thing, and it's truly, truly, I think, a vocation. And then I did skip the part of my story, which is that when like junior high school and high school, I was tracked very early on into science things. So which is an easy thing to do in San Diego because it's such a big science city. But I would do, I mean, a lot of my junior high school and high school in particular were doing things like, weekend programs at the Salk Institute, right? Weekend tours of scientific laboratories, working in the summer as a volunteer in hospitals. I mean, everyone was, so part of when my father was like, I don't care about the Parthenon, is that everyone thought I was going to medical school or something, But I just was not interested in science in that way. And it was when I went back to school and went to UCSD that I knew that I could use my true love and interest in science to think about science from other perspectives. Because at the same time, I also loved thinking about African American studies and Black history and Black studies. And so I kind of put those things together. But also at UCSD, and I had a lot of really, it's a huge school. I mean, there's probably, at the time I was there was probably 20,000 undergraduates or something, 15,000 undergraduates. But I had really great and close teachers, and one of my teachers was the astronaut Sally Ride. So I took a physics for dummies, effectively, class with her, and it just completely blew my mind. And it was, I got it, right? I mean, she was such a good teacher that at a really basic level, it sort of connected to the high school physics I had taken and got me interested. And these sort of classes for non-science majors are often about the real world applications or thinking in broader ways about science. And it was completely, and I took a comparable class and I came from a great chemistry professor. And so, I always had a little bit, it's been a long-term interest of mine. And I think San Diego is a huge, huge science biotech city, and to grow up in San Diego and not be interested in marine biology or, some sort of biotech would probably be the kind of odd thing. And then, so I do think, I think all of my work will always be about science for medicine and technology and Black experience, in part because there's so little work that's been done. I mean, there's a million projects to be done, and I'm so glad to now have graduate students who are working on projects that are sort of pushing these fields. But we have as a field, Black studies has very little work on science and medicine and technology. It's paltry, and so there are a million projects to be done, there's I've been thinking a lot about George Washington Carver and reading about, trying to revisit him as a different type of figure than the weird peanut guy. And much of the peanut guy stuff is apocryphal, it turns out. So, I'm interested in thinking about, what would it mean for African American studies to put George Washington Carver at the center of it? And that would be easy to do. I mean, he was at Tuskegee, there was lots of interesting things going on, and then you could also sort of think about the science stuff he was doing too, and how he, for the Panther book, I won't talk about it tonight, but one of the people I interviewed was a guy named Dr. William Davis, who teaches at a small college in San Antonio, who's the older brother of the late actor Ossie Davis. And he, like this generation of Black scientists, he did a PhD, I think, at the University of Idaho or Iowa. It's in a lot of, just in casual reading, there's been a lot of, one of these schools, either Iowa or Idaho, trained a lot of Black PhDs in chemistry and biochemistry and these sorts of things. It was Idaho, actually, because he works on potatoes. But he couldn't get a job. He couldn't get a job as an academic, and they wanted him to be a high school teacher. I mean, he's in his late 80s, and he went to Portland, Oregon, and started working in a kind of just as a lab director. And he helped the Black Panther Party run, analyze their sickle cell anemia screening tests and help them get their clinics off the ground. But I think there's a lot to be said about Black people in science and medicine that get beyond he was the first this, he did the first heart surgery, all the kind of proud first stuff that we do, which is important. I think, the one thing that I would say about applying for graduate school is that the key is to translate your passions into scholarly questions, right? So it's a work of translation, right? And it's a kind of performance in the sense that,
That's what I mean.
yeah,
It's a performance. You're putting on something that you're trying to show.
Because what you might feel is like, for me, it's just like,
It's like, this is what I
why are there so many, why is there so much inequality? Why, you know, like, that's what I feel, right? But on paper, it might be, you know, why is it that, you know, Dominican women in this age group in the Bronx experience X or Y, right? And sociologists, what, is this what you work on? You know, and so you frame that. So, you know, framing that might be like, we don't talk about women, we don't talk about Dominican women. You know, in this discipline, we've talked about women and Dominican women, but we haven't talked about this aspect. How do we think about that? And so it's about the work of translation. I mean, I think what George taught me, and you know, people like Robin and Tricia, is that, you know, the questions that come from the perspectives of, you know, from my perspective as a Black woman, are legitimate intellectual questions, right? And they allowed me to, you know, showed me literature and their own, you know, the example of their own work, right? Showed me how to get at those questions. And so there is a, you know, there is a work of translation. It is a performance. That doesn't mean it's inauthentic, right? It doesn't mean it's not true. But scholarship is a thing, and applying to graduate school is a thing. And probably what you're trying to demonstrate is, in part, that work of translation. And you can do that work of translation. So, yeah. I mean, I think that, okay, a couple things. You know, you want your best, you don't want it for graduate school. You don't want a letter from the preacher. You don't. I mean, I have students who go to their preacher and have them, you don't want a letter from father. Well, you know, Father's not academic, so that's different. But, you know, you don't, they're just like, you know, Preacher Johnson, write me a great letter, you know. No, you need your best letters for your best classes. And if you're applying for a PhD in sociology, and, you know, maybe, you know, your better letters will come from two of your English professors, I mean, that's okay. Maybe that's not ideal, but you want the letters really, really matter. And you want people who are going to spend time with the letters, and you want people we really read the letters. And you want people who can, so, you know, go and talk to your professors, go to office hours, get to know faculty members. It's my job to talk to you, it's my job to meet you, it's my job to write letters for you. That's what I get paid to do, so it's never, you know, we're busy and all of that, but it shouldn't be an off-putting thing, and you should feel very much entitled to ask faculty members who have taught you for a letter. Yes, I mean, because it goes into writing a rich letter, right? Because there's letters that are like, Mark is great, he's a really smart guy, I like him. But then there are letters that say, one day we were in a seminar and I posed a question to the class that befuddled everyone except for Mark. And then Mark took this, you know, he answered the question and he really drove the course dynamic that day. And then he took that question and developed it into a really fine seminar paper. So like, you need people to write letters for you who can speak to that. So I think it's very important because it adds texture to a letter. And you know, people who you're going to ask to write for you are writing letters for lots of other people, right? And so the more that they know you, and it's easier for them to, you know, if someone is striking to you or impressive to you, that's an easy letter of recommendation to write. The hardest letters of recommendation to write are the ones that are like, you know, you don't know them very well, you had them in a big class and you didn't really get to meet them, they didn't come to office hours. But if it's somebody that you know and that you have great admiration for and you see them change over time, those are easy letters. So those are the letters you want.
This has just really been wonderful. I mean, I think that that Alondra Nelson is just the ideal person to give this sort of talk, because it's clear that she's passionate about what she does. You know, that's kind of her sort of joy of knowing and curiosity is what has driven her career. And I think that for all of you, prospective professors, that's just a wonderful model for us. And we certainly gained a lot from it. Sort of the practical, what's it like to become an academic, and you know, what are some of the challenges? All of that, I think she led us to, you know, sort of shared with us. So we want to thank her also for writing the book, And, for covering such an important area of research, and for the wonderful talk, and for sharing her research with us. So let's thank her again.
I think your frame's a little wide.
Okay.
You know,
Okay, that's just it. Okay, here we go. Send this to Arnie Duncan for assessment.
Oh, yeah, that'll go.